the Lord has filled our world with examples of glorious presence. And whenever we are engaging those things, whether it's music or nature or art, we are standing in the foothills of a greater glory that we were made to know and enjoy.
Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. You know, art has the ability to captivate the soul, to be a mirror to the human experience and point to what is true. I've always been fascinated by the intersection of faith and beauty in the arts, and I think it's because they speak to a deep longing to be our full selves, which are people made in the image of God, co-creating with Him. In this conversation, Russ Ramsey talks about the power of arts and beauty and storytelling and how they can help us make sense of the brokenness in our world. Russ is the author of books like Rembrandt is in the Wind and Van Gogh Has a Broken Heart, where he dives into the lives and works of these iconic artists. And what he uncovers is so much more than just the paintings themselves. It's about the human experience, the joy, the suffering, the hope that these artists poured into their art. We talk about how engaging with beauty and art can actually be a window into understanding the glory of God, and how even in the midst of tragedy and heartbreak, art can help us find language for our own struggles and emotions. Russ also shares some incredible stories behind famous works of art, like the Mona Lisa, and why it became so famous. Spoiler alert, it's not because of the painting itself. So, get ready for a rich, thought-provoking conversation about the intersection of faith, art, and the human experience. Russ has so much wisdom to share, so join us. Here is my conversation with Russ Ramsey. Russ, welcome to Shifting Culture. Really excited to have you on. Thank you for joining me.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, right before we started recording, we were talking a little bit about Rich Mullins. The day that we're recording this is the anniversary of his death. And so one of the quotes of Rich in his songs here in America that I love, he says this: "There's so much beauty around us for just two eyes to see, but everywhere I go, I'm looking." And so I want to start there. Like, what is your relationship with looking for beauty and for art and in your life and in the world?
You know, it's funny. That is a quote from Rich Mullins' lyrics that I go to. In fact, I think even in Rembrandt is in the Wind, that's one of the quotes at the beginning of one of the chapters, is that specific lyric. I think for me, I've always been a person who has been drawn to kind of stop and pause and engage with beauty when I'm in the presence of things that are beautiful. From the time I was a kid, whether it was music or nature, and then art, visual art became a part of that when I was in my early teens, of just finding that I was enthralled by some of these paintings that my art teachers would show me in art class. And as I have been a follower of Jesus, I became a Christian when I was 15, and a very central part of my relationship with the Lord, my worship of Him in private, my worship of Him corporately, I'm a pastor now, involves contemplating beauty, the beauty of His creation, the beauty of His handiwork, the beauty of His Word. I get to work with Scripture week in and week out as a pastor, and I am enamored with the beauty of how Scripture unfolds, the layers of meaning and significance. And so it's something that's just been a part of my life, but it's the conviction that I guess has kind of developed as a result of that, is this conviction that if we want to really understand and know God as He is, paying attention to His glory is essential, because it's one of the primary ways that He is described, particularly when He appears to people. Is that it's a glory that's too magnificent to behold. It's not a temper that's too magnificent to behold. It's not a vocabulary. It's a glorious presence. And the Lord has filled our world with examples of glorious presence. And whenever we're engaging those things, whether it's music or nature or art or whatever, we are standing in the foothills of a greater glory that we were made to know and enjoy. And so, in the words of Rich, there's so much beauty around us, and to be people who are looking for it, I think is a wise and good habit for anybody who would call themselves interested in the things of God.
And I think it's hard for a lot of people to start to see beauty in the midst of really horrific things in the world and tragedy, heartbreak. Your latest book, Van Gogh Has a Broken Heart, it really threads the line, tells stories a little bit between the counterplay between sadness and beauty and wonder. Why, in the midst of it, can we actually see some of this beauty, even when there are like threads of sadness? How does that enhance the beauty that we see in the world?
I think it was Martin Luther King Jr. who said, "Only when it's dark enough can we then see the stars." Part of the function of beauty is that it is a response to the brokenness of the world that we live in. It's a counterpoint. And in fact, a lot of the art that I write about, and this wasn't by design, it was just something that became noticeable as I continued to study and write about art, is that so much of the world's greatest art that we respond to and we love is born out of either people who are deeply troubled and sad and struggling, or is about the human experience and those parts of being alive that are difficult. Even when you think about Michelangelo's David, it's a sculpture. It's a perfect sculpture. It's the only perfect sculpture, I think, in the world. But it is what you're looking at is a young warrior who is completely vulnerable, about to face in war the strongest enemy that personified that the people of God had in that moment. And all would be lost if he lost, and all would be gained if he won. And to capture that moment, it's not just the capturing of a physical being, but it is the capturing of a moment, of a story of people who have been through such hardship and have been through such rebellion and have had a hard road. Van Gogh's work is the same. Like, if his art is filled with sadness. I just taught a second grade class about Vincent van Gogh, and I showed them his pot of sunflowers, and I asked them to just look at it for 20 seconds. And I said, after you've looked at this pot of sunflower for 20 seconds, I want you to tell me some of the feelings that came up inside of you. And it was a test, and the test, one of the things that I wondered if it would happen happened, and that is a couple of the students said that they felt sad. And you're looking at a vase of sunflowers, and yet the way he paints them, there's a sorrow in his work that's contrasted with the beauty of the image that he gives. And I think it's not just that we're choosing to look at beauty, even though there's all kinds of brokenness in the world. It's that the beauty is beautiful in part because of how broken the world is. That to engage with beauty is to do business with the pain and the brokenness of the world that we live in, and to protest against it.
I think one of the people you write about in the arts is Norman Rockwell. And I just remember growing up, my grandparents had, coffee table books of Norman Rockwell. They had the calendars of Norman Rockwell. And it felt like a very sanitized version of America, of like glossed over, this is the ideal. And then you write about a civil rights era paintings that I didn't know about, because that's not what was in those books or those calendars. And I sent the paintings of Southern Justice and Do Unto Others, the Golden Rule painting that he did, to my wife. I'm like, did you know this about Norman Rockwell? And he was dealing with that. My question then is, like, why do we then try to sanitize the things that really hold up a mirror to us as a society that good art actually does?
I'm Corey.
And I'm Daniel.
And we are the hosts of the Light in the Darkness podcast.
We're a supernatural and paranormal podcast with Christian perspective. We talk everything from angels and demons and aliens to cryptids and witchcraft.
In each episode, we sit down with a guest and we listen to them share their stories of their encounters. Lots of folks, especially in the church, are experiencing weird stuff and they don't have anywhere to talk about it.
And that is where we come in. We create a safe environment for folks to talk about when things got weird. We also like to inspire thought and conversation along the way.
So subscribe to the Light in the Darkness podcast for bi-weekly chats about the stuff you don't talk about at church.
Until then, take care, y'all.
Yeah, it's funny. When I started doing these stories about artists, I made a rule, and that was that there would be no hagiography. So hagiography, if that's a word you've never heard, is a biography about a saint to demonstrate why they're a saint. So it's just the good stuff. It's completely, sanitized. It's a puff piece. And I was like, I'm not going to do that. Even though I love Van Gogh and Rembrandt, their stories are complicated stories, and they're complicated and sinful, broken people. Not to mention the others that I wrote about. And I think that this is a particular challenge for Christian people and for Christian companies that produce Christian material, is an idea that we should frame the Christian life as desirable. And the way we go about framing it as desirable is framing it as something where it's a happier life than anybody else's life. And Jesus said, in this world, you will have trouble. Take heart, I have overcome the world. But he also said, if you want to be one of my followers, deny yourself, take up your cross and follow me. Paul in Philippians told this church that was suffering persecution that it has been granted to them to suffer for the sake of Christ, that it's a gift to them from the Lord, they're suffering. For me, as somebody who writes about art, who engages with art, who is a writer myself, I think that what we really want, if we were to be honest, is we want art to help us make sense of the world, not to provide us with some kind of sanitized alternative that we can go escape into that isn't real. And so I think every culture has this problem, but in Christian culture, one of the problems of ours is that we will sanitize to the point that we're no longer telling the truth. And that's why good art can be created by people who don't know Jesus, because what they do understand is that the world is a broken and painful place and that we're all yearning for hope, and they're trying to make some statement about that. I much prefer art that's trying to be honest than art that's trying to be positive.
Yeah, I agree. Well, you just hit on something that I think it might be a particularly American problem. It probably is not, but since we have in our founding in America the pursuit of happiness as a goal, it feels like sanitation of the underbelly of truth is the way that we've tried to grasp onto happiness. What have you found as you've been even challenging your congregation or in your writing, the way that like the beauty of truth, even the ugliness of the world, actually has something to say to our well-being in life?
Ask almost anybody what seasons of their life produce the most spiritual growth, and it'll be a story of suffering, almost without fail. It won't be the times when everything was humming along and things were fine and we were making enough money and we loved going to work and our marriages were great. It'll be those times when we were suffering and struggling and having to try to navigate things that were beyond us. And I think that it's that biblical distinction between happiness and joy, right? That joy is this kind of deep-seated contentment in knowing that every sad thing will come untrue, of knowing that there will be a day when there will be no more crying, death, mourning, tears, or pain. The old order of things will pass away, and behold, all things will be made new. Part of the happiness that we experience in this life has to always be in the context of knowing that the Lord is redeeming what's broken. And so we bear up under it. And in the local church, we bear up under it in the context of a community of other believers that we walk through life with. But we don't have to walk alone, and we don't have to pretend it's not there. In fact, the worst versions of ourselves are the versions of ourselves where we're pretending that the broken things in us and the broken things around us are no big deal. Instead, it's when we're appealing to this need we have for redemption that we live in ways that are honest and true.
You know, one of the things that really have stuck with me for a long time, I interviewed Pete Greig once, and he said that faith is like a Rembrandt. It's all shadows and light.
Right.
And so it's a mystery that our faith is, and we actually get to move into the mystery of God and the mystery of faith and beauty and wonder and the shadows and the difficulties of the world all bring us to this place of mystery. I think we want certainty. What's the value of like art to bring us into like be okay with the mystery of the world that we live in?
I think art is a form of storytelling, and we are people of stories. I think there's a certain kind of pragmatic bent in the West where we try to approach faith as tell me what to do and how to kind of solve the equation and eliminate problems, and we get very pragmatic about it. But we're people of stories, and we always have been. It's why when the Lord told his disciples in the wilderness to disciple their children, he said, tell them the stories. Tell them about my faithfulness. Tell them at night when you're walking on the road. And then Jesus' primary method of teaching was storytelling. And they were stories that didn't always have resolution, and they were stories that he would tell and not always explain. And art does this. Art is declarative. It's storytelling. It's capturing a moment in time, arranging a composition that leads your eye through what it is that you're looking at in a certain sequence, where you take in a story as you stand in front of a still frame, and it raises questions. It shows us things that are beautiful. It asks us to reconsider things that we thought we knew. It shows us places in the world that we're unfamiliar with, and it stretches us beyond this compulsion that we often have to try to keep things tight and in order, and really beckons us to live in the mystery of this ongoing relational hope that we have, that the world that we inhabit and we live in is something that God has not forgotten and abandoned. And so there's a reason, and it's a mystery to me, why, every major city in the world has an art museum, and why people flock to those art museums to see these canvases that were produced by some individual in a room somewhere or in a grassy field somewhere, and now they're hung on the wall, and collectively as a species, we have said, these are important, and we need to make them available for everybody in the world to come and look at. There's something about that. It's the beauty, it's the storytelling, it's the history, it's the perspective, it's the shared journey of walking through the human experience that makes those things so valuable and reminds us that we're not alone in this world.
Take me into something. I go to my local art museum. We have a great art museum. I'm in Kansas City. Nelson Atkins is a fabulous art museum. Yes. So as I walked through that, I remember, my son and my wife were there, and there's some paintings where we're like, okay, I'm going to stop and I'm going to sit and I'm just going to be here. What is my role then as somebody like viewing art?
First thing I would say is, let me get you into the museum and then let me get you in front of a painting. I think never feel like when you walk into an art museum that your objective is to take in the art museum. There's just not enough time. If you feel like you need to rush through every gallery so that you can say that you've seen everything, you'll leave feeling like you actually saw nothing. Instead, what I do is I go find my people. I go find Van Gogh and I go find Rembrandt if he's there. And then I let them kind of show me around their room. And so you go into Van Gogh's room and he's going to introduce you to the other post-impressionists. You'll meet Paul Gauguin, you'll meet the impressionists, Monet and Pissarro, because they'll be around the corner there. And you read the little plaques on the wall. But your mindset should be a couple of things. First is if something arrests your attention, stop and give it your attention. It's tapping you on the shoulder. Stop and look at it. There's a painting in there's a series of paintings at the Nelson Atkins where you are of interiors of large halls. And the people are very, very tiny and the rooms are very, very big. And I can't look away from those. It's light and shadow. It's architecture. It's not anything particularly like rich in storytelling, but it is a magnificent vista. And they stop me, and I just stop and I look at them and I take them in. So that's one thing is and those little plaques on the wall, read them. But the other thing I would say is understand that when you visit an art museum, think of it as an installment in a lifelong journey with beholding. So you go that day and you put in some reps of looking at art. And then you go again another day and you make this a habit in your life that you watch a sunset from time to time. You read poetry from time to time. That you make it a habit of engaging with art, because one of the things that you're learning, and I think for people who visit art museums and don't do it a lot and feel maybe disconnected from art, feel a little intimidated when you go into an art museum, like what am I supposed to feel? I don't get it, and there's a lot of paintings and sculptures that you'll see where, yeah, you won't get it. It's not supposed to be got. But you're cultivating a personal habit of engaging with beauty intentionally. And that's the thing that is I think, the most valuable when you go to an art museum. You learn the stories and the paintings. And I'm a believer that when you find one of those paintings that stops you, that every person is walking around with their own little personal collection of art, paintings that they would say, that's one of mine. You see it in a museum and you're like, whoa, or you've seen it in books before, but you've never seen it in person, and you see it. It's different to you than anything else in the room because it's one of yours. And we build these collections, we carry them around with us in our hearts. And I think that that's part of the journey of appreciating art in this life that we've been given, is that it is very much a marathon and not a sprint.
My name is Father David, and I'm a Franciscan friar, and every week me and my guests dive into some of the most pressing issues of our time: church and state, immigration, LGBTQ+, economic inequality, anxiety, depression, climate change, and so much more. Join us in these conversations. Friar Time isn't just another podcast, it's where faith meets real life head on. You can find all the links to our podcast channels in your show notes.
But he talks about the role of your life is to get on this journey of beholding. Mm-hmm. And so we're beholding the art, and we're beholding beauty. And I think when I think of beholding, I think it moves me past the art almost toward, and then I get to receive and behold the beauty of God and what he has done and who he is as a creator. And that, everything that he has created, he steps back and says, this is good. This is beautiful. This is amazing. Then what is that relationship for us? How does that actually reflect our relationship with God as people who are beholding art and beauty?
I think one of the things that, we learn about God the Maker by looking at things that people make, because we are sub-creators in that sense, that to be made in the image of God, the Creator, means we are by nature creative beings. And so we make children, we make meals, we make flower beds, we make all kinds of things. We make buildings, we make paintings, we make spreadsheets, we do all kinds of things. that is a reflection of how God worked and continues to work. And I think we behold him in beholding created things. And for me, like in an art museum, one of the things that I always am fascinated by, and I think these architectural paintings that I was mentioning to you earlier, I can't even remember the painter's name for those paintings. But one of the things that I feel so like enthralled by is the question of how did they do this? Like how did another person with two lungs and one heart and, like a body like mine, apply paint to a canvas to achieve this? And because you're looking, what you're looking at is not just a finished composition, but you're looking at a lifelong journey of craft. And Rembrandt is my favorite for this. I love to look at, if there's a portrait, I think in the Nelson Atkins there's a portrait of a person who has a very elaborate, fancy lace collar, like a ruffled collar, and I get up as close as I can before they yell at me to try to understand, like, what did he do with his brush to achieve this thing that almost looks like a photograph in terms of detail. And you see the thought that had to go into the achievement. It's not just that he said, "Oh, it's a lace collar. This is how you paint lace." No, you have to figure out, like, is it white on black or is it black on white? Do you paint the white field first and fill in the dark, or do you paint the dark first and then paint the lace? Rembrandt did it a very particular way. He did it he painted the dark. So it would be a white field, and he would paint the dark in to make the white lace. And it's just sort of like ingenious, but it's this problem solving and this kind of thoughtfulness that goes into how did they achieve what they did to try to understand even a process is fascinating. And I think it reveals the complexity and the wonder of God in doing that.
I think one of the through lines of your work as a writer, what you've done in Rembrandt is in the Wind, and also Van Gogh Has a Broken Heart. And it sounds like what you do as a pastor as well is like narrative and story is absolutely key and huge. Mm-hmm. I was having a conversation yesterday about a creative project that I want to do with a filmmaker, and we were talking about one of the things, and so we were talking about the difference between storytelling and like a 3-point sermon, uh-huh. And with the difference that it impacts the world and the person hearing it in a different way, in a way that actually, I don't know, kind of seeps into their soul, into their body more than a like, here are the 3 points you need to know and go and get it. So what is then the importance of story and storytelling for us as people?
Yeah. Well, story is a Trojan horse for truth. You can slip a lot past people's defenses by telling them a story. You can disarm, you can invite circumspection, you can, there are all kinds of things that story does, because we invest in a story. We want to know that there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, and we want the good guys to win, and we want to know that the problem didn't prevail. We want to know. I think it was one of those guys said, fairy stories don't tell children that there are dragons in the world. They already know that there are dragons in the world. Fairy stories tell children that dragons can be beaten. And that, to me, is something where, when somebody, I've noticed this in teaching children, that if I tell them a very good story, they are glued to me. And as soon as I start to move into the moral of the story, I begin to lose them. And part of what they're telling me back is they're saying, "I already got it. I was there. You've handed it off to me, and now it's going to do its work inside of me, and I'm going to have to just think about it. I'm going to have to think about the implications of this story and imagine it in my head and understand that it's nuanced." Story, Flannery O'Connor said, a story is a way of saying something that can't be said any other way. And I love that because I think that story allows for mystery, nuance, unfinished business, and yet it still has resolve, and it still has some kind of a place that it takes us. And it's the most powerful way that anybody learns anything is through the complexity and the layering of story, because it makes us want to learn. We want to hear what's going on.
So then what story really resonated with you as you were writing this new book? Like this is the thing that this was a story that I loved and it impacted you.
I had two of them jump to mind. One is I wrote at length the story of Van Gogh slicing off his ear, because I have a chapter that's devoted just to that story, because I love Vincent personally, and I get a little offended when people joke about him cutting off his ear. And I think most people, if they know anything about Vincent, it's that he painted Starry Night and that he cut off his ear. And the truth is he hated Starry Night. He was embarrassed by it. And him cutting off his ear was the lowest point in his life as a painter. And those are the kinds of things I think, let's not joke about that. Let's actually try to understand why would he do something like that? Because it is a tragic story that really matters when it comes to understanding his work. So that's one of the stories. But the other story that really kind of got me going is the story of why do we make such a big deal out of the Mona Lisa? That was the question. And because I'm operating on the assumption that if people are honest, most people don't really like the Mona Lisa, or they don't see what the big deal is. And people will say, well, it's her enigmatic smile. And I'm like, there's plenty of paintings that have enigmatic smiles. And this isn't even the flagship of the fleet for a Da Vinci painting. However, it has its own room, its own bulletproof glass case. It is the reason people go to the Louvre. There's other things there, but it has its own special, and so I wanted to try to understand, like, what is it about that painting that we all regard it as kind of the pinnacle? And the story behind it is amazing because it completely validates that, we don't really love the Mona Lisa. The Mona Lisa isn't famous for being a masterpiece. The Mona Lisa is famous for being famous. She's a Kardashian. She was stolen at a time when a global newswire was just made available, and it became a true crime story. And she was stolen because she was on a wall with 25 other paintings, all scrunched together in the Louvre, and she was low enough and small enough that the thief could just lift it off of the wall, stick it under his arm, put his coat around it, and walk out. And it wasn't until she was stolen that people started to talk about the Mona Lisa. In fact, the Washington Post ran a story about the theft, and they printed the wrong image because they didn't know what the Mona Lisa was. And this is 1911. But the thing that made me so fascinated by this was the implication of Pablo Picasso's role in the story of the Mona Lisa becoming famous. And that is that he was one of the people the police brought in to question as the possible thief. And that story is just, you should pick up the book if you want to know more about that story. But it is wild to look at that and to see, we still do this. We still have, we still have things that are just famous for being famous, or they're famous for what happened to them rather than for what they are. And one of the journalists at the Times said, people, after the Mona Lisa was returned, said, people don't come to the Louvre to see the Mona Lisa. People come to the Louvre to say they've seen the Mona Lisa. And that's a big difference. That's a big difference. And it tells us a lot about ourselves. But that story, it just goes on, and it is really a good one.
It's a good story. I was reading, I was like, this is gripping. Have they made a movie out of that? Like,
No, I don't think so. Not that I know of. I thought the direction that chapter was going to go is the Monuments Men. I thought I was going to be writing about, initially, I thought I was going to be writing about the way that military units protected art from the Nazis during World War II, because Mona Lisa was one of them. But every time I tried to research, it just kept taking me back to this theft in 1911 and Pablo Picasso being attached to it.
yeah.
And,
I mean, that's awesome. I love it. I think, one of the things you just touched on the story right before that, before this true crime story, but like the heartbreak, the lowest point that Vincent van Gogh was going through as he cut off his ear.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one of the things, he was going through a lot in his life.
Yeah.
And I think we're at a point in, at least in our culture in the West, that we have a lot of mental challenges. We have depression, anxiety, rampantly. What was then? How did art help him as he was working through really what he was going through in his life?
It's a conundrum, right? Because he was he was your textbook tortured artist. But part of the reason that he was tortured in the way that he was, at least part of it, was because he was devoted to being an artist. Had he chosen a different line of work and been a workaday guy at a factory, maybe he wouldn't have been. Who knows? It's hard to know. But he gave himself to this pursuit of trying to capture the beauty of the world around him and the brokenness and the sadness of the world around him. He painted this picture of a bridge in a little town he lived in France, and he was describing it in a letter to his brother. And he was talking about the colors of the sky and the silhouettes of the people. And at the end of his description of a painting of a bridge, he said, "I'm trying to get at something utterly heartbroken and therefore utterly heartbreaking." And that idea of he saw the kind of the heartache of living in this world, even just painting a bridge. And he was trying to get at it. He was trying to extract that. Made it so that he was a person who kind of lived in that liminal space of feeling and brokenness and torment and then trying to capture the tension of sadness and hope together. And that's the reason why his work endures in the way that it does, is because it deals honestly with the plight and the nature of the world. So he gave himself to it, and he let himself continue to push on the bruise, so to speak, brokenness in his own life. And as a result, he helped us find language, I think, for ways that we struggle with the same things.
I think it's the finding language. I think that's what good art does, is find language for us and who we are. And so if people are like more analytical, they just want to know the inner workings of something, then how do artists really help us bring out our own feelings and emotions and things that we may not be aware of, that are hidden below? But I think artists do a great job of giving that language and that feeling to a place, because they're wired differently than some of us.
Yeah, that's a lot of the impetus behind both of these books, is to tell the stories of these, because I think you can see a painting and it can inspire you. But for me, like when it comes to Van Gogh, I know I keep coming back to him, but he's my guy, is I don't think of, when I think of Van Gogh, I think of his body of work. I don't think of this painting or that painting. I think of all the Van Goghs, and they collectively say so much more than any individual painting of a wheat field or cypresses or whatever does. That it's the body of work and then the story of the person who gave it to us. That is the true, I think, the truest reward for me when it comes to engaging with art and feeling and learning, because there's a when you look at somebody's body of work, you see the course of what they made and how they thought and how they developed and how they changed and how they grieved and how they hoped over the course of time. We were talking about Norman Rockwell earlier. He's a great example of this, where Norman Rockwell helps Americans see ourselves in that when he started painting, it was pre-civil rights era. It was an era where a person like him, somebody who, lived in the North, a white male living in the Northeast, did not really have to interact with a lot of racial strife. He was kind of in a protected class in a lot of ways. And even in painting for the Saturday Evening Post, was encouraged when depicting people of color to depict them in servile positions. And so if there was a black man in one of his paintings, he was a waiter on a train. But what happened with Rockwell is he changed. He began to, and his assignment was to show America back to itself. And so you have your Roaring 20s and your 30s and your World War II and the 50s, and then he starts to deal a lot more with topics like war and racial inequality and these sorts of things that move him out of the Saturday Evening Post and onto a different magazine entirely, because it just wasn't fitting in the same way. But he's a person where if you look at one or two of his paintings, you'll think kitsch, you'll think, sentimental. But if you look at his body of work, what you see is somebody who started off seeing the world one way and changed, and it's not that he lost his affection and his sentimentality. It's that it was that, and also it's this other stuff. When you take somebody's body of work as opposed to just a particular painting, the instruction that you get in the emotional complexity of living a life over the course of years is really, really helpful, because you see somebody have to course correct or admit mistake or introduce new information that they didn't really have before or didn't really understand before, or find themselves complicit in that now they see themselves complicit in. And so that's, I think, one of the things that art does is it gives us kind of this big timeline, century after century of people trying to say something clear and true about the brokenness of the world.
Well, I think that's kind of interesting, looking back and then the whole body of work and see how somebody has changed over time. I think one of the core tenets of the Christian faith is to change, is to metanoia, is to repent, to have this shift, to move into a different direction. And I just find it fascinating that the wider culture in America values people who have not changed, who are unchanged, who won't change their mind on something. And so I think that's a dichotomy of like art and faith, of saying, I'm going to encounter the truth. And because of the truth encounter that I have, whether it be in art or my experience with God, in scripture, whatever that piece is, I can actually then shift and change and go a different direction. How does that work then, if we're bringing that into this wider sphere of culture where most people value unchangeability?
I think even just confronting the value of unchangeability is a worthwhile thing. An artist can say, my job is to give the people what they want, and then they will produce a certain thing, and it will have a shelf life that will endure for as long as its fickle public is interested. Or an artist can say, no, I'm going to try to say something well and to say something true in a way that is my message as an artist. My favorite author, Annie Dillard, said about writing, she said, if there is something that needs to be written and you know it, you're the only person who can write it. And I love that sentiment. I love that idea of, if you are an artist and there's something that needs to be said and you know it, you're the only artist who can say it in that way. And so, well, I think one of the reasons that artists are known for being kind of the tormented souls is because the more you strive to be true as an artist, the less likely you are to be popular. And so the more you're leaning into something where you say, this is the message that I really want to get across. It matters to me more than anything else, is going to be met with more resistance than something where you're saying, I'm trying to just write a pop song. And so I think one of the things that artists do is they deny the request of a world that says, just give us what we want. Good artists will say, no, that's not my calling. My calling is not to give you what you want. My calling is to create art as an artist and to deliver a body of work over time. Engage with it or don't, but it's going to be on my terms, not yours. And then you can receive it, and you can interact with it, and you can learn from it, and we can all learn from it together. Or you can just have this diet of these other things, and at your own peril, at your own loss.
There are so many facets in that I think we can go down, but I don't think I will. But man, I think I can see that within the church when we've become institutionalized and worried more about failing institutions. So we're going to lose money and finances if we're going to actually share truth.
Yeah.
So we try to popularize the actual message that we're saying so that we can be safe and have the institution and the money continue. And it's a hard thing to navigate. But I think we're called to be artists in that way.
I think when it comes to the church in particular, I believe that people come to a church in part because they want to be told hard things. They want to be confronted with their sin. That's my operating assumption. And so I see churches trying to kind of brand themselves as being a place where you're going to come and you're just going to have a really good time. And I think also, you're going to look like parachute pants in about 4 years. Like you're going to be irrelevant. You're going to have to reinvent yourself because you're not anchoring yourself in ancient truth, but you're anchoring yourself in some kind of branded image that you think might appeal to a particular demographic. I think I'm a big jeans and t-shirt kind of guy. Like these things don't go out of style. The things that don't go out of style are scripture, prayer, and the local church. And those are the things that we're called to. And if we are committed to those things, if we're committed to being people who pray, being people who are faithful to teach the Word of God and to give ourselves to the study of the Word of God, and to do so in the context of a community where people get to know each other, walk through life together, as opposed to some kind of brand of Christianity. Ironically, you have the best shot at sticking around by being boring culturally. And so I see it. And I just think, who's got time for that? That's a young man's game right there.
Exactly. Russ, if you could talk to your readers, people who pick up Van Gogh Has a Broken Heart, what do you hope that they would get from your book?
One of the hopes that I get, that I hope, would be just that it would begin to erase any feelings of intimidation a person might have when it comes to engaging with art. It's a valid form of art criticism to stand in front of a painting and say, I like this. That's valid. It's also valid to stand in front of a painting and say, I don't get it. Cool. Like you've engaged with the work. So that's one of the things, because I feel like we deny ourselves engaging with visual arts because we feel like we just aren't academically trained enough. But no, we're instinctively people who engage with and absorb beauty and story, and that's what you get. The other thing I think is that I hope when people read this book that it gives them great hope in the face of the sufferings and afflictions that they experience in this life. All of the stories in Van Gogh Has a Broken Heart, in one way or another, speak to walking the road of suffering, and so the stories are more about that than they are about the origin of any work of art. They're about how these things came about and what was going on in people's lives and in the world that led to the production of this piece of art. And so my hope is that these stories would getting back to this idea of everybody having a personal collection, that these works of art would become parts of each person's personal collection, and the function that they would serve is to remind us that there's hope in the face of the brokenness of this world, and that there's beauty everywhere we look. And there's so much beauty around us for just two eyes to see. Everywhere I go, I'm looking. That's Saint Rich right there. Those would be my two primary hopes.
Great. Well, a couple of quick questions I have at the end. One, if you could go back to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give?
I think the advice I would give my 21-year-old self is, I would say, in trying to find your voice, you are finding your voice. That I'm preaching through. It's so funny that you're asking this question. I'm 51 and I'm preaching through Philippians. And the last time I preached through Philippians was when I was leading a college ministry in my mid-20s. So half my life ago. Lost all those files, didn't have anything. And then I reached out to a student who used to come to that, who I thought would be the person who would have still have them. And they did. And I said, would you send me my notes so that I can see what I taught on? And I look at them and I think they're virtually useless. Like, I look at my notes from when I was 25 and I think there's nothing really in here that I'm going to lift out and use now as a 51-year-old pastor. However, what I do see in this little time capsule of my own words on a page is I see me finding my way. I see me finding my voice. I see me figuring out how to be a communicator of Scripture. And I see things that I was trying then that I've since kind of learned how to navigate better. I've seen how, and in my particular vocation, I use my voice a lot. I use it when I write. I use it when I teach. And so when you're a 21-year-old, it's okay for you to say you don't really know yourself yet. You're learning yourself. But when I do marriage, a wedding, premarital counseling, I will tell people, you are marrying a stranger. You know them well enough to want to spend the rest of your life with them, and that's good. But when you say your vows to each other, there are so many things about one another that you do not know yet. And the reason you don't know it is because you're not married to each other yet. You haven't shared this house together. You haven't shared this life together. You haven't grieved a tragedy together. You haven't, all these things that come that make the two of you one. I think when you're young, it's okay to say a big part of the function of your 20s is to begin to figure out who you are in this world. And you're going to start from a place where you're unclear on that. And I think that's okay.
Yeah, that's so good. That's so good. Anything you've been reading or watching lately you could recommend?
I've been reading a lot of poetry lately, and I am a Midwestern guy with Midwestern sensibilities, and I do not like poetry that makes me work super hard to try to understand what in the world I'm reading. So I like poetry that one or two readings and I'm in the ballpark. But I have been reading a lot of Mary Oliver's poetry, and I just love it. I love Mary Oliver's writing and her poetry, and it inspires me to write poetry as well.
There you go. Mary Oliver. I love it. She's a great poet. Good poetry. Russ, your book, Van Gogh Has a Broken Heart. I've read a lot of books this year, a ton of books, but I really think that this one is definitely one of my favorites. It's fantastic. I love the stories, the way that you get into it, be able to think through story and beauty and arts and sadness and suffering, and just be with the story of things. It's just, I really love this work, this book. And so I really want a lot of people to go out and buy it and interact and get it. So how can people go out and get Van Gogh Has a Broken Heart? And where else would you like to point people to?
Yeah, I think you can, places I would recommend are, of course, you can go to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all those places. The Rabbit Room is a place that will carry this book, that is an organization that I am a part of and love and support. And I think they're great. Also, Hearts and Minds books. Byron Borger, who's a small independent bookstore guy. He would be his website is great, and I love to send anybody to Byron because Byron is one of those guys who, if you buy a book from him and you're just curious about other books you might like, he is a person who will help you find great things to read, and he'll do it in a way where he's really a curator of a book museum more than a bookshop owner. And so that's those are the places I would recommend. But you can get it anywhere. It'll be anywhere online.
It's great. Well, Russ, thank you for this conversation. I absolutely enjoyed it and loved talking through, art and beauty and suffering and God and beholding in the church. And we touched on a lot of fun things today, and I just hope people would go and actually experience art, let the emotions wash over you and get into the story of where it is and actually encounter the truth of what that art is saying and telling you. So, Russ, thank you for this conversation. It was fantastic.
Yeah, thank you, Joshua. I've had a lot of fun. This has been great.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you want to see more episodes like this, go to patreon.com/shiftingculture and become a monthly patron of the show. You can help us produce more episodes so that we can see the body of Christ look more like Jesus. If you become a patron on patreon.com/shiftingculture, you will get early access to episodes. You will get episode guides. You will get bonus shows, hopefully, and more. So go to patreon.com/shiftingculture and become a monthly patron. Also, leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps us out and helps us find new listeners to the show. And just go and share this podcast with your friends, your family, your network, people that you think would enjoy it as well. Thank you again for listening to the show. I hope you have a great week.